Okay, hello everybody. Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but hopefully we've got it worked out now. And hopefully everybody can hear me. So I'm just going to get going. And again, apologize for the slightly late start. First of all, I would like to just offer a huge thanks to LSU Press and Corey Calabria for helping set up this book launch, and more generally to everyone at LSU Press. I've absolutely loved my experience working with the press from the beginning of the project until now. And I would especially like to thank James Long, who worked with me in the early stages of this project, and the design team for creating such a striking book. I don't know how well you can see this on here, but it's just a beautiful cover. And when anybody sees this, when I had my advanced copy, they asked me what role I had in choosing the image and the design, and I had to admit absolutely nothing. That presses tend to hate my ideas for covers, so I just wanted to trust the design team, and I'm so glad I did because it looks stunning. And finally, I'd just like to thank everyone in attendance today. I know we are all busy. I plan to talk for about 25 minutes today about the book and its context, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts after this. As probably most of you know, my name is Bill Hardwig, and I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Tennessee, where I also took my undergraduate degree. I specialize in 19th and 20th century American fiction, and until this project, considered myself primarily an archival researcher interested in reconstructing the forgotten histories and of past environments of writing and reading. For example, my first book, Upon Provincialism, looks at periodical culture of the late 19th century and the ways that new narratives about the post-Civil War South were negotiated in national magazines, such as the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's, familiar magazines even today. But the book I'm speaking about today, How Cormac Works, is a very different kind of project. My focus here is on the surface of texts and their style, which is quite a departure from my other research, where I was laboring away in dusty libraries over issues of periodicals written 130 years ago. I grew up in the same town as McCarthy, Knoxville, Tennessee, went to the same university as he did, studied in the same department, but was never introduced to his work in a college setting, and that includes my undergraduate or graduate work where I studied in Chicago and Florida. And it wasn't until I left Knoxville and was living in Chicago that I found McCarthy on my own and his first really popular book, All the Pretty Horses, which had just recently been released. After that, I worked backwards into his Tennessee period, especially Suttree, his novel about mid-century Knoxville, which is an absolute pleasure to read living in Knoxville or when you're set in Knoxville, and forward over time as new books were released. But after reading that first book in the early 1990s, being spellbound by the languid descriptions of the Mexican landscape and his zany characters such as Jimmy Blevins, I was hooked. As I mentioned at the beginning, this book feels like a huge departure from my normal archival research. Much of academic research feels separate from the teaching we do, as paying attention to minutiae and obscure topics and complex theories may not interest our undergraduate students or even be accessible to them. How Cormac Works, on the other hand, grew directly from the experiences I had with my students in the classroom. So, for example, I've taught Appalachian literature here at UT most every year for the past 20 years. And I found that in that class and other classes, students gravitated to McCarthy more than any other author. They have an option to write on any number of things, and they time and time came to McCarthy and were interested in McCarthy. For students, the interest is partly subject matter. Why is the text so violent, they wonder? Why are there so many taboos and the breaching of those taboos? Why such nasty portrayals of parts of Appalachia? But more often, it's about his language. Why did he write it like this? What are the weird first-person chapters doing in there? What is this paragraph about? Or, I looked up this word, which is obsolete, the dictionary tells me. Why would have McCarthy chosen this one to put into a modern story? I think we can also see this in the public. You know, think about online forums, Reddit boards, public talks that I've been fortunate to give, that there is a real interest in the public in parsing his language, thinking through his aesthetic choices. I've been to a number of McCarthy events where it just involves people going around the room reading their favorite passages. That doesn't happen with very many other authors, and I really think it speaks to his investment in language. Another interesting sort of part of this for me is that students seem to feel called by his work and called to produce art in response to it. I'm going to show you 4 things that I received from students that came out of some classes we did. They're all pieces of artwork. I don't know if you can see this one, but it is a bookmark from Child of God that a student made. Here's another one, which is, you might recognize if you are familiar with Suttree, is a thing of presumably Suttree under the Gay Street Bridge down by the river, which is where that book takes place. We have this one where a student was interested in a sort of famous part of Knoxville, a viaduct that wasn't in Suttree, but he thought captured the spirit of Suttree half a century later. And then finally, one more, I have this one. You can tell this student was a graphic artist, or is a graphic artist, but it's a picture of McCarthy looking frustrated and saying "arg," and then all the things says violence, murder, racism, baby eating, shootings, all these sort of things, and then ends with nothing matters. That's an editorial take about his response to McCarthy, but I've probably taught hundreds of authors over the years, and I've only received art from students connected to one, and that's Cormac McCarthy. So something about his work really inspires people. I intended this book to be a hybrid text that would make an academic contribution. It's very important to me that it was at a university press and the rigor involved with that, and LSU is a perfect fit for this book, I feel. But I also wanted it to speak to public readers. It isn't intended for expert scholars of literature solely. I hope that lovers of McCarthy's literature and readers of fiction more generally will find it useful and even enjoyable. I hope that this book will speak to the public and remind us all why we feel so strongly about the fiction we love and the writers we cherish. And since this is a book so much about language, I thought that a way to get us into the mindset of language, which I'll be talking about, is to read a short quote by Lee Clark Mitchell from his book Mere Reading, which is sort of a formalist look at the process of reading. And this is a quote from Mitchell. "Literature occurs in the verbal woof of words, sounds, rhythms, patterns of syntax, figures of speech, even marginal asides and casual interruptions. Or from a different figurative angle, it emerges in the interstices, in odd formal patterns and disruptive sequences, as words are invoked imaginatively, often fancifully and misshapenly, askew from their sometimes more obvious meanings, and in constructions that draw our eyes away from straightforward plots to more disruptive cadences, our ears away from sense to sound." And I know that's a sort of mouthful to hear rather than to read, but this has really been a guiding sort of idea in my study as I worked on this book. I want to pay attention to sounds, rhythms, patterns of syntax, the sort of odd formal patterns that we find in McCarthy, and the disruptive cadences where we get something that we don't expect. And in Mitchell's things, our ears move away from sense or meaning to sound, the musicality of language. So there's been a lot of excellent work on the philosophical commitments in McCarthy's work, his relationship to other authors such as Melville, Flannery O'Connor, Dostoevsky, and literary movements, maybe literary naturalism, American modernism, for example, and in his engagement with different historical periods, especially Blood Meridian, which is focused on the 1800s and has some historical figures in it. However, less systemic work has been given to his use of language and his style, even as it is often mentioned in one of his defining qualities as an artist. So people mention it, but then they often move on to do other things. So I thought what I might do to just give you a sense of the book and my commitments in the way I frame it is just to read the first paragraph of the book. I'm not going to read much from here today, but I thought I would read the first paragraph just so you can sort of see how I set up the argument. As different as his novels are from one another, Cormac McCarthy's writing, which spanned a career of 6 decades and 12 novels, feels cohesive. When we pick up a novel by McCarthy, no matter the length or style or topic, we know we are reading McCarthy. There's something about his writing that feels unique and enduring and consistent. One aspect of his writing that links all of his novels is his unswerving commitment to formal experimentation. Motivated by a love of language and the possibilities therein. While it is McCarthy's grim depiction of violence and his text's complex philosophical perspectives that receive the most attention by scholars of his works, readers who treasure McCarthy's novels are typically drawn to the work initially, as I was, at the level of language, the breathtakingly original way McCarthy strings together words and paints images in the reader's mind. So in this book, I seek to do something different. How Cormac Works focuses less on the what McCarthy writes about and what his characters say, than the how McCarthy structures his fiction, how this structure contributes to his literary style, and how this style creates unique reading experiences for those who engage with his work carefully. And so in this book, I try to identify and explore McCarthy's medley of styles, the way he changes tone and mood, often very suddenly in his books. By paying attention to the surface and stylistic movement in the work, I found that one of the defining attributes of McCarthy's fiction is the often incommensurate relationship between the tone and mood of the writing of a passage and the subject matter therein. We get tenderness where we expect horror, meaning where we expect none, and a lack of meaning when we most expect and need it. We get strange and unfamiliar descriptions where we expect clarity, and concise prose where we expect evasion or deferral. And this is central to McCarthy's work overall. I think it's one of his defining attributes of all of his literature. And so the title of the book plays both on the idea of working as a means of production, Cormac working on his craft as a writer, and the idea of functioning or operating, how his literature works for readers. And so as a way to capture that, I organized the book around ideas of modes and moods. I'm borrowing here from the terminology of music, musical modes and musical moods, in order to suggest an important aspect of McCarthy's work occurs at the level of sound, the musicality of language, especially his language. So modes invokes the idea of a technical construction of a piece of music in the way I'm using it. And moods is the more slipperier way that music can call to us, create impressions within us. And just to show you one more thing that I think the design team did a fabulous job of this. So there's two parts of this book. The first one is modes. And if you can see this here, I've got a couple of quotes over here that set up that one, but then they've continued the theme of the cover in black and white over here on this page. And then the same thing when we get to the second half of the book and we get to moods. Sorry. The same thing. It's divided by the landscape and some quotes to sort of set it up. So that's just another excellent design quality that I had no idea that was going to be in there, but that I like quite a bit. So I thought I would just give you a sort of brief, quick overview of the structure of the book. So I mentioned the first part of the book, modes, and in that I have two chapters. Chapter 1 explores the various registers that McCarthy uses, tonal registers, how his tone is often at odds with his subject matter. I look at three modes here that I identify. The tender mode, where his tender language is at odds with the gruesome subject matter he writes about. The biblical mode, where his writing in select places suddenly sounds as if it comes from the King James Bible. And if those of you are familiar with his work, you probably can think of some passages with that. And then finally, the dramatic mode, where he uses dialogue with very little narrator commentary to explore issues of faith and meaning. And I will return very briefly to a passage in the tender mode in a couple of minutes just to show you what I mean by that and sort of show what I have in mind by these modes. Chapter 2 is called Large, Loose, Baggy Monsters, which is one of my favorite phrases coined by Henry James to characterize long and messy novels. He is thinking here of War and Peace and Three Musketeers, but I think you could apply to any of these just sort of large, messy novels. And I use this term to address what I call McCarthy's epic mode. a mode in his longer and more chaotically organized novels, principally Suttree, Blood Meridian, and The Crossing, where he seems to be writing for posterity and makes epic gestures and historical and literary allusions. They're often absent in his other works. It's sort of making epic, seeing these in terms of epic statements. So that's part one. Then we get to part two, moods. Chapter 3 pays attention to McCarthy's love of natural description and his thick language of his novel's landscapes. I used the term taxonomic mood to suggest that much of his work shares a sensibility with that of 18th and 19th century naturalists, such as William Bartrand, as McCarthy shares a taxonomic sensibility observing and classifying the components of the natural world. And I really feel there is like an almost biological commitment, or biological rigor to his identifying, to classifying and charting the various parts of the natural world, plants, flora, fauna, that kind of stuff. Chapter 4, the precarious mood, suggests that McCarthy's final two novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris, which were released in 2022, are concerned with the and in order to explore this precarity, McCarthy borrows from the language of theoretical physics and abstract mathematics that give room for an exploration of the ideas of indeterminacy of life at every level. So those of you who know anything about McCarthy's biography may know that in the last couple decades of his life, he was quite a presence at the Santa Fe Institute, which is mostly a scientific think tank, which is committed to tackling large and complex issues, complexity theory and those sort of things. But McCarthy was a welcome member of that. And through there, he developed some knowledge and terminology around physics and mathematics that he could use to tackle subjects he's been interested in for a long time. And this mood is further explored in that chapter with McCarthy's sense of the precarious life of displaced citizens of East Tennessee, a subject in his previous novels that returns in these books. And then finally, the very short epilogue pays attention to how much McCarthy loved the rhythms and expressions of local stories and dialects, be they in East Tennessee, West Texas, or Northern Mexico. It is a closing tribute to his attention to musicality, to how closely he listened to and appreciated the voices around him. And so just to give you a small sense of one part of this, I thought I would read selectively from chapter 1. And again, I'm not going to read very much, and a lot of the reading will be quotes from McCarthy that are interested in. And I'm going to talk about the idea that I call his tender mode. And in the part I'm reading here is a section of that chapter called Tenderness and the Refuge of Language. And what I'm interested in is the way that in a lot of his work, the language seems to buoy us up even when the subject matter doesn't. And the way I get into this subject, into this topic, is I begin with a discussion of Cormac McCarthy's famous interview on Oprah Winfrey's show right after The Road came out. And I talk about that a little bit, but I especially talk about Palmer Murphy's 2007 excellent sort of art piece called Cormac Visits Oprah. And I don't know how well you'll be able to see this whole thing, but I'll try to get it on here. If you can see this, we have Oprah Winfrey on one side and Cormac McCarthy on the other side. And in between are all the figures from his fiction, scenes from those, and they bring up the specter of violence, the idea of just sort of how violent and gruesome a lot of his subject matter is. And that is certainly the case. But what I'm going to talk about now is that often there are these moments of linguistic tenderness as he is talking about those. So, yeah, I am suggesting in this chapter that we can find this rupture of gentleness and this incommensurability of much of McCarthy's language and his fiction's content as defining tenets of what I'm calling the tender mode. It is a distinctive element of McCarthy's style that can be used to characterize and understand his writing. As much as he seems to enjoy writing about dead babies hanging in trees and the spurting of arterial blood and heads split to the thrapple, he loves equally the precious ability of language to paint images of tenderness where we least expect to find them. And so in this part of the chapter, I talk about moments of tenderness linguistic tenderness in a lot of his books. I think for the sake of brevity here, I'm just going to focus on one book, and that's Child of God, which is the book that I teach most often in Appalachian literature, and just give you a couple of moments where I see this tenderness erupting. The reader of Child of God is forced to oscillate between Lester Ballard's murderous necrophilia and McCarthy's tender descriptions that surround and contrast Ballard's violence. The oscillation of tone between chilling starkness and whispered tenderness begins as early as the novel's second page, when we are first introduced to Ballard. Sandwiched in the same paragraph between a characterization of Lester as small, unclean, unshaven, with a constrained truculence, and a description of him urinating on the ground, is a tender description of the scene, one that doesn't appropriately fit the foreboding tone of the introduction of Lester. And here we have a short quote. Wasps pass through the laddered light from the barn slats in a succession of strobic moments, gold and trembling between black and black, like fireflies in the serried upper gloom. In this scene where Lester is about to be dispossessed of his family home, hit on the head with the dull side of an axe, and forced to wander the winter mountains in search of a new place to live, we have a brief but precious moment of quietude, wasp passing through laddered light, gold and trembling. The effect here is not related to the plot or the rising scene. The stillness is not there to build tension, for example. Neither does the effect correspond to what is going on. We aren't to assume that Lester feels this tranquility or observes his setting with tenderness. The description doesn't bring sympathy towards the character either, and it is immediately undermined by the unpleasant description of Ballard urinating. But the reader is left with a moment of stillness that feels tender and dear. And again, I go through a few more examples of this in this book, but let me just give one more example where we can see this, and this is sort of towards the end of the book. The book follows Ballard as he commits crimes of sexual assault, necrophilia, and murder, and we watch his depravity in all its grotesquerie and vividness. At one point, after Ballard escapes a vigilante mob who seeking vengeance for his murders, he flees to nearby caves where he gets lost in the darkness. As he begins to believe he will die here, he hears mice and he imagines them after his death nesting in the recesses of his skull. A dark scene, to be sure. It is here where we get another moment of linguistic tenderness, imagining Ballard's skeleton in the cave. So this is Lester using language he wouldn't use, imagining his own skeleton. His bones polished clean as eggshells, centipedes sleeping in their marrowed flutes, his ribs curling slender and whitely like a bone flower in a dark stone bowl. We could imagine from a different approach the idea of a fleeting nature of life here, or Ballard's fear, but I'm struck once again by the language. Bones polished clean as eggshells, ribs curling slender and whitely, a bone flower in a dark stone bowl. This passage brings to mind David James's suggestion regarding the road that we consider how description can misbehave, how it hatches rogue aesthetic plans, how indeed it becomes, through the sumptuous pressures it exerts on what it describes, a type of narration in its own right. And there are a couple of ways we might think about this specific item of a bone flower in this passage. The first and common explanation is that the term is a synonym for the common daisy. The image in this light prefigures McCarthy's misbehaving images of the molten rose in the road, and a Blood Meridian startling image of blood dropping in the water like rose blooms. These images reveal just how much McCarthy enjoys uses tender descriptions in his unfolding of gruesome scenes. But in this passage, the bone becomes a clipped flower in the bowl, its precious white petals in stark contrast to the dark stone bowl. It is also very reminiscent of Ezra Pound's famous and sparse modernist poem, In a Station of the Metro. If you guys remember that, it's a two-line poem that was published in 1913, and it reads like this. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The surprise in Pound's poem comes from the erupting of the unexpected, a flower emerging ghost-like from the dark and dingy subway platform. And in all of these examples, the images being connected to the flower is at odds with what a flower typically symbolizes: purity, innocence, beauty, delicacy. And in the place of this expected symbolism, McCarthy aligns the images with blood, danger, and skeletons. So I think I'll stop there. I've got some other places where I talk about the other associations of bones and flowers, memento mori, for example, in the sort of tradition of skulls and flowers. But I want to just end with one final thing that when I was doing the research for this project, I discovered the work of the Japanese artist Hideki Takashige, and I got a chance to meet with him. And he's got a collection he calls Honibana, which is absolutely stunning creation of flowers that are made out of the clean bones of rodents. And I thought it fit so perfectly this idea of Lester. And I don't know how well we'll be able to see these because they're very delicate images, but here's some examples of Hideki's work, Tokashige's work there. You can see those are made from rodent bones that have been cleaned, but they're these delicate flowers. And this one is photographed and is called Chinese Lantern Plant #2. So if you go to his website, which you can just find by searching Honebana, Honebana, you can see some of his other striking work there. It's just absolutely fabulous. And very much, I think, in keeping with that sort of tender language of McCarthy's imagining of Lester. So I'm going to wind up here now. And so in conclusion, I think that one of the aspects of being a professor that I most value, apart from the teaching, which is what sustains me, I find working with students, working through text with new readers is invigorating and rejuvenating. Each semester is a different thing. That really is what sustains me. But the other aspect I most value is the freedom to pursue intellectual and aesthetic challenges that I feel are important and that capture my interest. I've had the pleasure of hanging out with McCarthy's novels for several years now. It was a very insulated experience and very rewarding. That kind of immersion is not something I take for granted and something I cherish about the work I do. It brought me closer to the preciousness of language, which defines to me McCarthy's larger project, and it is this preciousness that I tried to capture in this book and in today's talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that great presentation, Bill, and for showing us that cool artwork. We actually have a lot of great questions in the chat, and so I'm going to start with fellow LSU Press author Monica Miller, who would like to know if being in Knoxville helped inform your work on McCarthy.
I think it definitely did. As I talked about, I first discovered him in Chicago, and it was interesting that I started reading about Knoxville while I was working on the 72nd floor of the Aon building during one of the summers of my study there. But, I think you often look at the place you came from in a different life once you leave it. And so when I had the chance to return, I just really enjoyed thinking about it. If you know Suttree, that is a book that maps really well onto downtown Knoxville now, as much as it's a very different place 70 years after that. But you can walk around the streets and see the scenes and the places that were described in his work. And I think more generally, just the first 4 books are often called his Tennessee period, and they are interested in Appalachian. So Knoxville being set in Appalachia is a really interesting way to look at what is his investment in the region and what is he trying to do. As we may know, he wasn't born in Knoxville. He's not a Southern person or a Tennessean by birth. He was born in Rhode Island, but he came down when he's 4 years old and lived here. So in some ways, I think his family was not from East Tennessee. So I think in some ways he saw it as an outsider, and maybe that's part of the way he was able to capture so much of the distinctive attributes of it. So thanks for that question.
I really like that comment about place being an ever-evolving thing. That kind of complicates the idea of being from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
This one's from Sebastian, who would like to know if you posit similar theories about gentle tones and such regarding the brook trout paragraph that is at the end of the road. The person says they've always been struck that the final paragraph of the book is about something altogether unrelated to the plot itself.
That is a fabulous question and observation. And yes, I do actually quote that very paragraph as one of the most distinctive ones. And so those of you who don't know, that is a book about post-apocalyptic horror where everything is burned and desolate. And then we get this final paragraph of brook trout wavering in streams from a previous time, and of containing the mysteries of the world that could not be put back again. But yeah, I think that's the perfect place where we see this tender language. It might be a little bit different in the road because I think that is tied to the central meaning of that book, is the way I read it, is what can be lost through environmental devastation, through that kind of stuff. And if you know about brook trout, they are some of the most sensitive to environmental change, the ones that if the water get too acidic disappear the most quickly. So in some ways they're the canary in the coal mine of mountain streams. So I think he chose those both for their sort of beautiful patterns on their bodies, but then also for the sign of that sort of preciousness. So yeah, that's a wonderful example of exactly what I'm talking about. So there's almost nothing tender in that book, and then at the end it ends with something that really sort of shakes us up.
We got one here from Cody. The question is, how much of the new material in the archives makes it into your book? They say they remember you mentioning some of the documents on Cormac's youthful naturalism.
Well, I would say a conservative estimate of that would be 0%. There's just not, it was not available when I was writing this book. It just became available this fall. So for those of you who are not familiar, he had a lot of archival work in the collection of the Whitliff, which is at Texas State in San Marcos, Texas. And he's had stuff there for decades, but a whole bunch of new material was just released after his death so in 2023. And so the library has been working to get those prepared and cataloged, and they just opened it this fall. So I look eagerly towards going and seeing what's in there, but I have not even seen it yet.
We got a question from Jim about McCarthy's cinematic writing. Could you speak a little bit about him screenwriting, um, and if I'm understanding this question correctly, how screenwriting may have impacted his own writing?
Sure, I think that's part of what thinking through that is part of what made me think of the dramatic mode, as I called it in here, because there are moments where it almost feels like you're reading a screenplay, even in his novels. If those of you know No Country for Old Men, the most famous adaptation of his work, the Coen brothers sort of joked that they chose that one because when they opened that novel, it read like a screenplay, that it was so um, easy to convert. And I think they're being a little bit tongue in cheek, but that it lent itself to being revised. So that's why that was probably not one of his most famous books originally, but it is the one that led to the most famous movie. Some of his other books have proven trickier to adapt to film, and I'll get back to the question of screenplay language in a little bit. But James Franco he converted Child of God into a one, and that didn't work at all, in my opinion, because Child of God does all this linguistic defamiliarization of the gross stuff that happens in the book. So we are aware of it, but we don't have to witness it. And then you get to the film and you're just watching it, and it's really, really off-putting to me. And people have been similarly trying to adapt Blood Meridian. I forget exactly where we are with that. I think there's somebody working on that, but that's in some ways a very cinematic book, but it's also got all these unusual digressions that would be hard to figure out what would make it into the movie if it were going to be sort of like Moby Dick. How do you make Moby Dick into a movie? You could make it into an adventure about chasing whales, but then you're not really getting to what the book is about. I think some of the same stuff goes back to the difficulties of Blood Meridian, because people have been trying to adapt that to a movie for decades. I will say that back to the idea of his idea of screenplay, he is interested in screenplay. He has written The Sunset Limited, which he calls a novel in dramatic form, but it reads very much like a play or a screenplay, and it was adapted to film by HBO. And then, he's also written some plays. he says that he finds drama hard to write, which I find sort of interesting because he has these dramatic moments where it's just, especially the very last book that he wrote, Stella Maris, is just two people talking back and forth with almost no narrative interruption, and that is just the character of Alice or Alicia and the therapist Cohen, and it's just back and forth between them, very much like a screenplay or a play. But he puts them in novelistic form, and he thinks of them as novels.
That was great. Thanks for that. We got a question from Katka, who would like to know if you explored McCarthy's inspiration in John James Audubon's work.
I did not look at that specifically, but I think it would fit very well with that chapter where I was talking about the natural world, and I agree that that one could fit very well. I think the reason I went back to the naturalists from an earlier time period, from the 18th century, William Bartram, is because there's these moments where McCarthy likes to put in the Latin name of animals he runs across, or his characters run across, of plants he runs across. And so that's something that Bartram does a lot, is he's telling a tale, sometimes a very fascinating tale, about like maybe meeting up with Cherokee people in the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains of the 1770s, where there's not a lot of interaction between settlers, frontier people, and native peoples in this area. But even when he's telling that story, he stops and describes every single plant he meets, gives the Latin name, and that kind of stuff. And so it's that commitment to the logging and the classifying that I found where my interest went. But I think the Audubon stuff works very well as well.
We've got one follow-up question from Sebastian. He wants to know if you integrate any analysis of the passenger into your book.
I do. I haven't verified this, but I think this might be the first book that has a full chapter dedicated to the passenger and Stella Maris. There have been a lot of excellent articles published on those, so I don't want to say I'm the first person thinking about them, but because books take so long that they're in process for so long, I think we've had some books that mention those sort of in passing that probably inserted after the books were written. But I spend the last chapter working through those completely. That's where I talk about the precarity of the world, and I found it really interesting. If you guys have not read that, he's got this really fascinating character called the Thalidomide Kid and his cohorts, which are maybe figments of imagination or hallucinations of Alice, but they also seem to have a very real presence in the book. And what they're there is trying to prevent this woman with suicidal tendencies, to try to distract her. And so they put on plays, they tell corny jokes. And it's this really interesting thing of drawing on the history of entertainment. They bring in vaudeville, they bring in film and that kind of stuff. So like the whole swath of 20th century entertainment as a way to try to get this depressive individual to stop meditating on her obsessions and to just basically distract her. So that's a very interesting book. That's one that I think we will know a lot more about once people start publishing on the research, on the archives that I was not able to get to for the publishing of this book. The interesting thing about The Passenger is that there are drafts of early ideas of that book as early as 1980. So he worked on some version of that book for over 40 years. And what I don't know, and I don't think anybody, well, maybe a couple people who have just visited the archives, but what we didn't know till very recently is, when did the book evolve in what ways? So I think at one point The Passenger was going to be one big book, and then it got split up into two companion books. Was that dialogue that I just talked about in Stella Maris always there, or when did that come in? He's also got some of his interest in science that shows up in this book that I'm sure was not there in the earlier versions. McCarthy wrote a nonfiction piece published in a scientific magazine called The Kekuli Problem about the benzene ring and how our minds work in language and that kind of stuff. And some of the ideas in there show up in Stella Maris and the passenger almost verbatim. So it'll be interesting to see what parts of that he wrote at what places, if it's put together well enough. So I do talk about that book, and I found myself confused by it at first, but I've read it now 5 or 6 times, and the more I read it, the more it really intrigues me. I think it's a really fascinating book that fits together with its companion book, Stella Maris, in really, really sophisticated and interesting ways.
We've got one more question in the chat, and then I'm going to ask a final question for you. This is another question from Cody, and let me read his question. It says, I see in Blood Meridian a connection between taxonomizing and the destruction of native peoples and artifacts in the judge character. If Cormac uses the taxonomic mode in earlier works, does the judge become a figure of self-critique?
That's a great question. So I think just for those who may not be familiar with this part of that book, the judge is somebody who wanders through the desert, records everything in his journal, and even sketches out artifacts, land formations, and that kind of stuff. But then, if he does come across artifacts, he destroys them afterwards, and he says, "Whatever exists without my consent." Well, he's basically trying to sort of take command of the world that he can observe and all that kind of stuff. So I do think that it's either, you could say it's a critique of his interest in taxonomic, or maybe just a less productive or violent way that that taxonomic interest could be applied, that you could take this interest in understanding and use it for rebuilding the complexities of the natural world, but you could also use it, as the judge does, to try to control it. So I do think that maybe this idea of, to what extent does our understanding of the world, of the natural environment and that kind of stuff, often get used for issues of power, command, control, and that kind of stuff. So in that way, the judge would sort of, in my reading, be an inside out version of the spirit of a lot of his stuff in other works.
Bill, we really appreciate your time with us this afternoon, and we'd like to close our author talks with a question, which is, what are you working on right now? What's in the pipeline?
Yeah, I've got a few things I'm thinking through. You guys aren't even going to let me rest after I finish this book. No, but the few things, the projects that I'm thinking about, one is, if I do more on McCarthy, I'm interested in his interest in rock quarries around East Tennessee. They appear in so many of his books, and they play important roles. They also were areas where McCarthy himself wandered around as a child. He lived in an area very near a couple of rock quarries. So do a little bit of that sort of history of rock quarrying and the role that it shows up in McCarthy's work. But I also think I want to return to my dusty libraries and my archival research of the late 19th century. I have a real interest in the work of Charles Chestnut. I've done a lot of work on Charles Chestnut in the past. But whereas that work is about his work in the 1880s and 1890s, he stopped writing in 1905, but he sort of, or stopped publishing his novels. But he also did a lot of writing essays and was on a speech circuit. So I want to look at his speeches from the 1920s, because he's got an interesting place in the 1920s as a Black writer, where the Harlem Renaissance is happening, but it has a very different aesthetic and maybe even ethical sensibility to Chestnut's work, which feels more rooted in the 19th century. So look at that. And if I don't end up doing either of those, I grew up in a commune in a southern town of Knoxville, Tennessee, and I thought it might be interesting to revisit that and do a memoir of what it's like to be in a commune in Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1970s from a child's perspective.
Uh, we'd love to see all of that, but the last one especially sounds like really fun. Um, that's all we have for today. I just want to thank everyone for attending and finding our link after all those technical difficulties. So we appreciate you. And just a reminder that you can get 40% off Bill's book by using the link that we have in the chat. Bill, do you have any closing words before we sign off?
No, just thank you, everybody. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to share this work with you.